Thank you all for joining. I know that there's so many CVS events that are happening, and I know that there's probably a gazillion other places that you could be right now or events that you could attend. So it's really nice to see everybody come together to these somewhat informal research presentations, which I enjoy a lot. So this is just a super brief background. I joined CVS in 2017 as part of the management division, and my background is in psychology. So not necessarily business, not necessarily finance, but the questions more broadly that I'm interested in is really kind of this question of how we can use data, how we can use all of these traces that we leave in the digital world to better understand what I call human condition. So it's really kind of people's motivations, preferences, concerns, aspiration, fears, you name it. And part of that broader research agenda is this question of financial decision making, right? So we all make decisions of how to spend our money pretty much every day. And one of the reasons for why I think this is in a way a particularly interesting topic is because there's so much room for improvement, right? Like most of us, and this is myself included, we're not very good at managing our finances, and almost nobody enjoys it. So we are very quick at spending. We're not necessarily really good at managing or saving money. And for most of us, it's this necessary evil. It's not something that we enjoy a lot. And it's funny because even when it comes to spending, we oftentimes do this relatively mindlessly, which is, it might sound like a cliche, but I really think it's true that we spend so much time and effort into getting money. And we don't really think much about how we can make this money work for ourselves in return. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's just such a fascinating area for research to really try and see how we can change that. And in a way, I do believe that psychologists are somewhat uniquely positioned to do that. And one of the reasons is not that we're really good with money or finances. That's certainly not the case. But spending in some way is extremely personal. Right, so there's this this research which I love, which shows that spending really is some kind of unique fingerprint. So this is coming out of the MIT Media Lab, and what they showed is that it essentially only needs 3 data points to uniquely identify you in credit card metadata. So if I know that, let's say at 8 o'clock in the morning on a specific Saturday, you went to Starbucks and got a chai tea latte, and then you went at noon to a specific Chinese restaurant on 72nd Street, and then back to Columbia and bought something in the CBS deli, then that's such a unique signature to you that there's only one person who has this signature. So it's really kind of almost like an identifier of who you are. For me, what's more interesting is this idea of like, can we use this type of self-expression as a way to learn something about your more psychological traits, right? So it's unique to you as a person, but it can also tell us something how different groups express themselves and who they are on a social demographic level, but then also more deeply on a psychological level. And the reason for this goes all the way back to Levy, who said like people buy things not only for what they can do, but also for what they mean, right? So the way in which we spend money, it's not just for functional purposes, it also really has the symbolic meaning of like helping us to express ourselves to the outside world. So in some of my work, we really kind of try to test this and see how is someone's spending related to their personality. And this is again where big data to some extent meets psychology. So we published a paper where we essentially show that simply by looking at your credit card transactions, we can to some extent predict who you are as a person in terms of your personality. And those are just from your credit card spending, types of spending or categories of spending, and that are indicative of the 2 ends of one of the personality traits, right? So if I had you guess now, which of the 2 lists represents prototypical spending for introverts or people who kind of prefer to spend time by themselves and not necessarily the ones who seek out large crowds, and which of the 2 lists represents prototypical spending for extroverts, those are the people who love to have other people around them. I think you probably have a pretty good sense, right? It's essentially kind of, you have extroversion on the left, introversion on the right, and you can see that this makes a lot of sense. It's what we call face validity. So extroverts, they are spending money on all of these social things that allow them to meet with friends, express themselves, potentially draw attention, to themselves and be the center of attention, which is one of the characteristics of extroverts. And then introversion looks somewhat different. It's like pets at home, home appliances, home electronics, right? So all the stuff that make your home somewhat more comfortable. We can also think of personality and these individual differences in terms of how we can actually use our money to increase happiness and satisfaction. And this is a debate that's been around for the longest time, this idea of, does money really buy happiness? And you have like all of these sayings that money can't buy you happiness. And what we know is that it's true that it's not just about the money per se. So it's not just having more money necessarily gives you greater happiness. It's true that if you have very little levels, very low levels of household income, that does decrease your happiness just because it introduces a lot more stressors into your life. But millionaires are no happier or not more satisfied with their lives than someone who has like an average household income of about $60,000. But what research suggested, and that's one of the things that got me interested in it, is it kind of asked the question, well, if money is not buying happiness, maybe it's because we're not spending it right. Maybe we're just not using it. We're not getting it to work for us. And the early work in this context, and which I think is interesting, so I'm just putting it out there because I do think we can all learn something from this, is what they showed, and this is mostly research coming out of Harvard, HBS, is that you gain greater happiness from your money when you spend it on others rather than yourself, which is to some extent, I think, counterintuitive, because we oftentimes have this idea of like, oh, if we just get this thing for ourselves, we're going to be happy. And what they also show is that if you spend it on experiences rather than material goods, that also increases your happiness and your life satisfaction, which also I think has a lot of intuition attached to it. Because if you think of experiences, they create memories, so you can always go back to them and just reminisce in your in the experiences and adventures that you've had. But one of the questions that I, as a personality psychologist and as someone who believes that people are different, kind of had when I read these papers is like, this is great. So I'm 100% with you guys that there are certain types of spending that generally on average increase people's happiness, but clearly we're not all the same, right? So if you just take a stupid example, going to a rock concert, which now sounds amazing in times of COVID because it's just not happening. But if you think about what type of person enjoys that kind of experience, which technically should help us improve our happiness and life satisfaction, if you just look at those two characters, I think it's very likely that they would enjoy get different types of levels of happiness by going to this from going to this rock concert, right? So the guy on the left, they probably love it. The girl on the right would maybe be happier just buying this new pink handbag. So it's not necessarily the same type of spending increases happiness for everybody. So one of the questions that I got interested in pretty early on was this idea of like, maybe the way that we derive happiness from spending is by matching the types of stuff that we buy to our personality and to our psychological needs. So what I did with a bunch of colleagues, that was still when I was working towards my PhD at the University of Cambridge, we teamed up with a bank. So this is like a bank in the UK, but essentially we asked them, can we survey some of your customers? And then can we, with their consent, match their survey responses where we ask about their personality traits, which is usually something like we'd ask you a question saying, I'm the life of the party. How much do you agree with the statement? And then we infer that you're more or less extroverted. We also measure their life satisfaction, and then we map those survey responses back onto their transactions for the previous 6 months. And so this is kind of a pretty substantial data set where we can really see what is it that people are spending their money on, how does that map onto their personality, and then how does that predict life satisfaction? So the idea was that if your personality matches your spending, say you're an extrovert and you spend more money on going to bars, to pubs, or you're an introvert and you spend more money going and buying books or buying something for your home, that this would actually increase life satisfaction. And this is what we see, which I think is really stunning because we don't see any effects of how much money you have, how much money you spend. So it's really kind of coming back to this idea that it's not about the money per se, it's really about how you spend it. And if you manage to sit down for like 5 minutes and kind of think about this a little bit and try to be a little bit more mindful of, is what I'm spending my money on, is that really something that satisfies my needs and motivations and not just something that potentially makes me look good in front of others or something that other people might expect me to buy, then this seems to have a pretty strong impact on your life satisfaction. What I should say also is that this is just one contributor, right? So I'm not saying that if you now match your spending to your personality, that you're going to be the happiest person in the world. Like we know that other factors such as sleep, which I highly recommend, social interactions, right? Having friends, having the social networks, those are all more important for your life satisfaction and happiness. But the reason why I think spending is interesting is that it's something that we can all change relatively easily. It's sometimes hard to say, well, I am currently unemployed. I know this is bad for my life satisfaction. Let me just quickly find a job. But this is something that you can change really on a daily basis. Now, it's not surprising that this has also been exploited, used, whatever you want to call it, in the context of marketing. So some of my own work is essentially looking at understanding the psychology, the personality of your audience. Does that allow you to influence the likelihood of purchasing something, for example? So if you just kind of think about this for a second in your mind, let's say you are a beauty retailer, you want to get people to come to your website, you want to advertise on Facebook, you want people to click on the ad, go to your website and then purchase something from the store. Just kind of conjure the image in your mind. How would you advertise this to introverted and extroverted users? And I'm pretty sure that you all had kind of some image in mind, because that's the beauty of psychology. It's so intuitive, and personality is something that we can all relate to, but pretty simple. In this case, we just came up with different advertising copy. So like extroverted copy would kind of, it was like always something going on. It was exciting. It was multiple people. The copy, I think in this case, would say something like, dance like nobody's watching, but they totally are. So playing with the need for extroverts to be the center of attention. And then introverted images would always be like one person in front of the mirror in a much more quiet setting. And so we use this to advertise to introverted and extroverted users. And what we showed is essentially that you see about a 50% uptake in conversion. So the number of times that people actually purchase something on the website, which is also true for return on investment, when you match this message to people's personality. So it's not that we're changing anything about the product, it's simply the way that we talk about it and the way that the consumer then feels about the specific product. Now, this is one of my favorite questions, is like in business schools, we oftentimes talk about spending, right? But like, shouldn't we probably also be trying to encourage people to save more? And this is something that I've recently become more interested in. And so we know one of the things is that different types of personalities or different people have a harder or easier time saving. And to some extent, this seems to be related to people's personality. So one of the personality traits in the models that we're typically using is the trait of agreeableness. So that's how trusting someone is, how empathetic, how much they care about their social relationships. And what we find, and this is across the board when we look at individuals, we look at the actual spending, we actually look at how personality is distributed in the UK, in this case, across different geographic regions. And we see that those who are higher on agreeableness, they have on average lower savings, higher debt, and higher default rates. So if you think about the level of geographic units, that just means higher bankruptcy rates, which to some extent is really a sad testament, right? Because like nice people, agreeable people are the social glue of society. So those are the people who are kind of generous, who are more likely to volunteer, for example. But it seems to be the case that they have this, this potential downside of not necessarily managing their finances as well. What is also quite sad about this line of work is that, as you can imagine, this effect is even stronger for low-income individuals. So if you're already struggling and you have this disposition to be nice, then this seems to be hitting you particularly hard. So it just seems that if you don't have a financial safety net already, you simply cannot afford to have a nice personality. And what we found when we tried to look at the mechanisms of like what is driving the effect, like why is it that agreeable people seem to finish last when it comes to financial decision-making and managing their finances effectively. And what we found is that it seemed to be mostly driven by people's attitudes towards money. So we had this idea that maybe it's because agreeable people, they are not as effective in negotiations, which is what I teach at Columbia, so that's why I was interested in that. But it seems to be the case that they simply don't care as much about money. And one of the reasons for this, I believe, and this is yet to be studied empirically, but I think the way that society thinks about money is like this false dichotomy of you can either care about others, right? So you can be a nice person who cares about their social relationships, or you can care about money. It's oftentimes this image that if you care about money, you're not someone who really cares about their social relationships. And I think this is just not true, right? This is just such a false dichotomy, because maybe you should care about money because you care about others, right? If you're mismanaging your finances, that's just not going to be impacting yourself, but it's also going to impact all the other people in your family, your loved ones, that didn't really necessarily have a say in how you manage their finances. So out of this research came the research question, or like a follow-up question is like, okay, if that's the case, we know that maybe we can frame certain saving goals depending on personality, right? So if we're thinking about how can I get agreeable people to better manage their finances, well, then maybe I want to highlight the fact that they're managing their finances and caring about money is not just benefiting themselves, but it's benefiting their loved ones. And this you could imagine also working for other personalities. So it's really kind of coming back to these two characters here. Even if we think about what could potentially motivate them to save, it's most likely very different things. So I dove deeper into this topic, just kind of looking generally at like levels of saving and with a particular focus on the US. And the picture that I found was honestly quite shocking for some of you that might not be new. When I looked into this, I was like, this is absolutely crazy. So in 2020, about half of Americans report living paycheck to paycheck, and about 2/3 do not have enough savings to cover 3 months of living expenses, and over 10%, which is like 1 in 10 people, could not even cover a single week without getting paid. So the situation we're in really is pretty dire when it comes to savings. So what we did in this case is we partnered up with SaverLife, which is a money management platform, and with the FinTech initiative at Columbia Business School that is led by Robert Farapnia, who I think is also on this call, and who is doing an amazing job at really driving this FinTech route within CBS, and to see if we could help people save more by matching their saving goals to their personality. So we tagged onto one of the challenges that SaverLife was running anyway. So they have these challenges where they encourage people to save more or save $100 or more over the course of 4 weeks, so an entire month. And if they manage to do that, they get entered into this prize draw and they have a chance to win. And in this particular case, what the intervention looked like, again, we kind of collaborated with SaverLife to make this happen. Is we screened their user base. So in this case, we only looked at users with $100 or less in savings. So those are really people who are struggling, right? This idea of having someone who has less than $100 in savings, saving an additional $100 over the course of a month is a huge undertaking. So we looked at their user base, we screened them based on their personality. So we sent them a personality questionnaire that they completed, and then we randomly assigned them in an experimental design to 1 of 5 conditions. So some people receive personality matched messages. So again, if you are an extrovert, we would encourage you to save more money, and such that once COVID is over, you could go out and have an amazing time with friends. There was like the gold standard, which was the message that they had developed and curated over time that they knew was effective in getting people to save more, random message, and then no message at all, which is the control group. People who signed up for this were essentially receiving 5 emails over the course of a month. And again, those emails just included the personality matched messaging, the random message, whatever condition they were in. And then at the end of this month, we could essentially look at whether they had managed to save $100, which was the goal of the challenge, or not. So it's like a binary outcome in this case. Now, let me quickly orient you to this graph. So what you have here on the y-axis is the percentage of people who managed to save $100, which means obviously the higher the better. And you have all of the conditions on the x-axis. The one that I'm most interested in is the personality matched condition, which is what I call the treatment condition. And then there's 2 different options. Oh, let me just start with the no message control, right? So those are people who were never contacted about the challenge. they essentially didn't see anything. So the baseline of how many people managed to save $100 was about like 3 to 4%, so pretty low. And then there's conditions, and this is what you see in these bars. So those people were assigned to one of the conditions. We sent them emails, but they never opened any of these emails, right? In the beginning, they were kind of keen to participate, but then they never actually looked at any of these messages. And it's a really nice control, because you can see that it's at the same level of the no message control. So if you don't see the messages that we send you, we wouldn't expect any effect. Now, let me show you what this looks like for the people in some of the control conditions. So this is, they received the gold standard message, which is the one that they had crafted over some time, and random message, which is like randomly drawn from these messages, or a message that mismatched their personality, all roughly the same, same number, about 7 to 8%. And now the final one that we were very happy about, this is like when you're doing research and the hypothesis plans out, it's always a very happy moment. But what you can see is that when the message that we sent you to encourage you to save matched your personality, there was actually a pretty significant increase in the number of people who managed to save. And I'm not saying this is perfect, right? But every single person, I think in this context really matters. Okay, and with that, I'm through with the presentation. It's really been a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to answer questions. But this has been great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. That was really interesting. And we have a few questions coming through. We have a question actually, first complimenting you on a great presentation and loving the findings, especially some of the research results, for example, the personality traits, agreeableness, and savings. But with those 3 traits, would they be different if compared across different cultures? And what are those differences between developed and emerging economies?
So I think I cut out for a second, but I got most of the question in the end.
If it's UK or US based research, how would the personality traits, agreeableness, and linkage to savings and spending, how do you think, or what has the research shown to be across developing or emerging economies versus developed economies?
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question. So I don't have a strong empirical answer. And so what I do know is that a lot of the research that we've done on agreeableness, for example, that was across the UK and the US, which again are like very similar in terms of the culture. And my expectation would be that you see the biggest difference between individualistic and collectivistic cultures, right? So this idea that you should care about other people is much stronger in collectivistic cultures than it is in individualistic cultures, just because that's the social norm. So the fact that we're seeing this effect in individualistic cultures that don't necessarily emphasize this kind of looking out for other people, I think my expectation will be that if you take it to a different context, different cultural context, the effects might be even stronger. If you don't highlight the fact that money is actually a way in which you can look out for your family.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Have you considered what implications this research has for designing consumer finance and credit policies that are effective across individuals and personalities? Some context. A lot of research about spending behavior is focused on how to identify who will be able to pay their loans, who to make certain offers to, robo-advising and other individually tailored short-term policies. But we don't often think about how these policies and credit scoring policies more generally create incentives for individuals across behavioral characteristics. It seems like behavioral research like this would have a lot to contribute there. So this is more in the credit and lending space.
I mean, it's an excellent question, right? So there's like a couple of different directions. One is that you do see that there's just like a lot more ways in which you can actually determine the credit worthiness of a person. So like your typical bank approach of we're just going to look at the background, where does someone live, how much money do they have, I think is now increasingly being complemented by, are there any other ways that would allow us to determine whether you're credit worthy or not? And there's like obviously a question of, if I have to look at all of your data, what are the considerations for privacy, for data protection? Who are the people who have to go down that road of selling their data, or like at least providing their data to potentially get credit who otherwise wouldn't get it? So right now, I think there's this trade-off between you have someone who otherwise wouldn't be able to get credit, and now they just have an extra additional opportunity to get it through potentially providing some of their data. But I think it's like a very critical question when we think about inequality when it comes to privacy. The second part, which I think is really interesting, is this distinction between trying to identify people at risk and then having strategies to kind of help people become better, right? And ideally, and this is usually what interventions are trying to do, is that you try to increase like likelihood of everybody. So that means like if I have personality tailored interventions, hopefully they would help someone with a lot of savings to kind of be better, but it would also help someone who doesn't have that many savings to become better. So it's like this, the idea of, and you might see bigger effects among the low income individuals just because they might kind of need this additional push kind of to save because it's so much harder for them to do, right? If your trade-off that you have to make is like, am I gonna kind of put food on the table or get my kids a gift, or should I save something and put it to the side for a rainy day in the future? It's much harder, and you need like much stronger motivation to actually do that. And so I think it's an excellent question because it really depends on how do we identify people, but then also how can we just encourage people, the ones who are at risk and the ones who are not at risk, to do better when it comes to saving.
And just in addition to your question that you posed, there is a professor in our marketing department, Oded Netzer, who does really great marketing research around the actual textual information that credit applicants provide when taking out or seeking a credit loan. This was done several years ago, and it was a case study of a lender who utilized application paragraphs. And so what he did is looked at the usage of different words to predict the credit default risk of the potential borrower. And he found that when people invoked God, when people said please, and when people said thank you, these were in word cloud distributions, these were indicators of a higher default risk. So it goes back to the concept of agreeableness, and also just what you can use from a personality basis through writing to influence or predict the level of risk around a potential borrower. So just a side note, if you're interested in looking at Oded Netzer's research, he definitely has a great paper on this. Okay. This is interesting. This is a little beyond the scope, but have you studied the effectiveness of using personality trait outcomes from questionnaires to actually market products that will address psychological problems? So like self-help.
So I assume that this is psychological problems refer to mental health problems is what I would be interpreting this as. And it's a great question. So this is, I mean, one of my main research agendas, and this is like just a little bit of background. So I did my PhD at Cambridge, and you can imagine that doing a PhD in Cambridge, focusing on something like psychological targeting profiling, immediately puts you on the radar of people to mix you up with Cambridge Analytica, which I had absolutely nothing to do with. But a lot of my research now is focused on how we can actually use data science and like these types of psychological targeting for good. And I do think that there's a huge potential to use it in the context of mental health. So one of the projects that I'm working on with a postdoc at CBS is essentially looking, it's like different contexts, but it's essentially looking at whether we can predict early signs of depression from smartphone sensing data. So that the problem with depression is, right, if you're suffering from depression, you're not necessarily going to go out there and seek help, because that's part of depression is that you kind of look towards the inside and you're not necessarily as expressive. So what we can look at is essentially, are there changes in behavior? So is it that you're not leaving the house as much anymore? Is it that there's just much less physical activity? Potentially you're not kind of having as many social interactions as you used to have before. So those are all indications that there might be something going on. And the idea is really not to say, we put a label on you and we say that you have a depression right now, but it's just to flag and then have the opportunity to intervene. So if we see that maybe you haven't entered like a full depressive episode, but you might be at risk, So now we can suggest things that you might want to do, right? We could suggest you to kind of reach out to some people. In the most extreme case, and there's like many different ways in which you could approach this and many different opinions of like what is too invasive, what is not too invasive. But if the user consents, you could imagine having like a system in place where when you're feeling great, you nominate 3 friends of yours. And then if there's something unusual, those friends get messages such that they reach out to you, because we know that in this case, it's hard for you to reach out. So this, I think it's a super like interesting context outside of finance, but I think very promising.